I'd like your reaction to the latest scoop, as Axios has called it, that Ukraine is going to be receiving Patriot missile systems from Israel. Of course, this is a move by the United States and the Trump administration, which is a way to get around this unambiguous cancellation of foreign aid, which the ambiguous part about this is that military aid has not been spoken about so much when it comes to Ukraine. But here we have Patriot missile systems still going to go to Ukraine, despite what you said, Scott, that this is going to get incredibly bloody for Ukraine, even though it already is. So your reaction to this?
The freeze on foreign aid is a State Department freeze on foreign aid. It's something that Marco Rubio has enacted. The Department of Defense has not put out a similar declaration, as far as I'm aware. The State Department doesn't control much of the military assistance that goes to Ukraine. If you recall, the military component of U.S. aid was done through the Ramstein Contact Group, which was headed by the Secretary of Defense of the United States. This is a Department of Defense activity. And so the monies that were allocated were primarily from the Defense Department budget and were managed by the Defense Department. And so when you shut down aid, State Department aid, it doesn't impact the Department of Defense activity. And the Biden administration made a big effort to push the aid that was approved into Ukraine. Not all of it was there. Much of it is still in the pipeline, still in warehouses awaiting shipment. But unless there's a State Department component to it, that stuff's still flowing into Ukraine. So the idea that Ukraine has had the spigot turned off isn't accurate. The problem is the follow-on, because again, this stuff goes in there, and I don't know how to describe it to people. The meat grinder doesn't just grind up meat, it grinds up equipment. And all this equipment that flows in is just going in there and getting ground up. So it doesn't change the outcome on the battlefield. The Patriot missiles, Israel had, dating back to, 1991, had received Patriot missiles from the United States, the old, PAC-2, initial PAC-3 versions of the Patriot. These were mothballed. These were put into storage because they don't, we're talking, that's what, 35 years ago. That it's old equipment, and the older missiles, the older PAC-2, PAC-3 missiles, likewise were put into storage, kept in reserve, just in case Iran wanted to do one, big True Promise 3, they could bring these things out and try and shoot down some of the Iranian missiles. Right now, Iran's not going to be attacking Israel anytime soon, if ever. And the Israelis recognize that these weapons are just rotting in a warehouse. So they are going to make them available to Ukraine. And so 90 of these old Patriot missiles, and guys, stop getting excited, all those people with the Ukrainian flags, 90 missiles, oh my God. Oh, this is wonderful news. Oh, they're old. Many of them have expired. And because they're old means that their performance isn't going to be, what you think it's going to be. They're not going to be able to shoot down the vast majority of Russia's newer missiles. They might be able to have some effectiveness against the, Shahed type drones and things of that nature. But, this isn't top of the line stuff. This is, old stuff, much of it on the border of line of being expired, meaning that it's not even safe to use. The launchers that are associated with this are going to be sent to the United States, where Raytheon is going to refurbish them, do some maintenance, because they've been in storage. They're not frontline systems. They've been in storage. And, who knows how well they've been maintained. So they've got to be worked over by Raytheon before sent on to Ukraine. It's going to take months for this to happen. So this isn't going to tilt the balance anyways, but we're talking, 90 missiles at, between $2 and $3 million each. We're, $270 million there, plus probably another $1.5 billion in launchers. We're talking over $2 billion worth of U.S. military equipment. none of which is going to change any outcome, all of which will be destroyed the moment it gets in to Ukraine, just condemning more Ukrainians to death, creating a false sense of protection that exists. The Ukrainians have a tendency to deploy Patriot missiles and then around strategic areas, and then put equipment and such in the warehouses protected by this. And what happens is the Russians do simple. I used to do it all the time. You just look at the photographs, you plot the Patriot systems, and you look at what they're protecting, and then you look inside that protected area for things, and you find out where warehouses are full of equipment, and you blow them up because the Patriots can't stop you. But all they've done is concentrate the stuff that they think is going to be protected in this, in this protected area, and it's going to get blown up. These Patriots will make Ukraine weaker, will cost Ukraine more lives. That's the reality of it. We think we're playing a game that, where we're doing things that, give Ukraine an advantage over the Russians. It doesn't. It makes Ukraine weaker. This is the reality of this war. Everything we do for Ukraine makes Ukraine weaker, costs Ukraine more people, and allows Russia to accrue even greater advantage.
There was an article in The Economist that talks about a recent Russian gain, the liberation of Velika Novosilka. Speaking with a commander of the Ukrainian army, Pavlo Fedosenko, who is talking about the troubles that they had in this particular battle. He said they might throw Russia battalions worth of soldiers at a position we've manned with 4 or 5 soldiers. The brigade that make up the Donbas front lines are consistently understaffed, under pressure, and cracking. The front lines keep creeping back. He said, we no longer have tactics beyond plugging holes. We throw battalions into the chaotic mess and somehow hope to stop the grind. Scott, can you talk about what you know about this recent gain by Russia in this small town? And what is this commander talking about when he says plugging holes with regard to the ongoing fighting on the battlefield?
Again, I want to direct everybody to a Substack written by Maryat Kurillin, I think is his name. I apologize for butchering the first name, but Marat Kurillin. He has a Substack page. It's in English, and he maps. He puts out sometimes two very detailed reports from the front lines where he tracks it. He has an outstanding cartographer who actually, when they first started their collaboration, the Ministry of Defense came in and said, you got to stop making your maps because they're too damn accurate. You got to dumb them down a little bit, but they're still the best maps out there for the conflict. And he has described this battle, and he's described others, every single battle that's done. The Ukrainians used to be able to come in and dig in, and then you get into this grind that we talked about. And you would do a rotation. So you'll throw 30 troops in to hold a position. They'll fight and they'll get wounded and all that, and then you rotate them out. You bring in fresh troops. You take those guys back, treat the wounded, get guys rested. Now they get in line. They get more, and so basically you just start rotating troops out. And the Russians are doing the same thing, but again, attacking is more difficult than defending. And what happens is the Ukrainians would be able to, because the Russians aren't going to commit suicide. If the Ukrainians can, find a position in a village or a town that they can fortify, they make it very difficult for the Russians. And indeed, in some cases, the Russians would just stop attacking because it was too powerful. And this allowed the front lines to be somewhat stable. So even if the Russians did capture a village, what the Ukrainians would do, because the moment in a heavily fought battle of that nature, the moment the enemy retreats, you're actually at your weakest point as an attacker when the enemy withdraws from a position, because offensive operations is very chaotic. You've lost communication, you've used ammunition, you don't know, where your wounded are, and you take a position, and if you haven't consolidated that position, you're very vulnerable to a counterattack. And so what would happen is the Ukrainians would pull back, the Russians would come in, then the Ukrainians immediately counterattack, bring in reserves, counterattack, and throw the Russians back out. And then you have to start all over again. And that's the way this war was dragging on. You'd get battles like for Bakhmut and other things where the Russians would put in a lot of resources and they'd be able to grind the Ukrainians down and actually take ground. But it's very expensive fighting, very deadly fighting, and you're not making tremendous gains. What's happening now, though, because of this grinding down operation, the Ukrainians can't put 30 men into a position. They can send 5 or 6. And now here's the thing: 30 men in a position, you can have several pickets out there. As the Russians advance, the pickets notice the engagement and they start laying down suppressing fire, and then more troops can come out of the bunkers into prepared defensive positions and start laying down fire and beat back the attack. But when you only have 5 or 6 guys, they're underground, and so they'll come out and they'll attempt to lay down some sort of suppressive fire, but then the Russians will hit them with artillery, pull them back into their bunkers, and now the Russian infantry will surround them, swarm them, and then it's just a matter of throwing in grenades, throwing in mines, and burning them out, and then out they come. And that's what's happening now. The Ukrainians have no chance. These 5 or 6 guys are dying or surrendering, but they're not holding the position. The Russians will come in. It's a slow, methodical thing with overwhelming power. I don't know if it's a battalion against 5 or 6, but it might be a company against 5 or 6, and that's still odds that the Ukrainians can't win. There's no supporting arms coming in for the Ukrainians. If they do fire some artillery, the Russians are hitting it with counter battery fire, drones, suppressing that. The Russians' biggest problem is drones. The Ukrainians have been very effective at bringing drones in, but the Russians are now starting to counter those drones with their own anti-drone countermeasures, which include, by the way, going in with their own drones and finding out where the drone operators are and targeting them and killing them. The Ukrainians are running out of drone operators because it's one of those dangerous things. If you pop a drone up and you're out there flying a drone, understand that there's a couple Russian drones overhead looking for where that drone came from, and then focusing around trying to find a vehicle or an antenna. And then they start bringing in the missile fire, the artillery fire, the counter drones, and they just saturate the area and kill. And then when you lose your drones, you lose your fire support, and you're down in a bunker, you die. And this is what happened. The Russians came in and they just basically took the town because the Ukrainians ran out of people. There's nobody to rotate back in. The guys in the front have insufficient manpower. They often feel abandoned. They don't have ammunition. They don't have communication. Their commanders have left them. And oftentimes they'll surrender rather than die. But when they decide to fight, they fight to the death. And that's something the Russians have been telling me the whole time is, one of the things that surprised the Russians is that these Ukrainian defenders were being put in impossible situations. They don't stand a chance at all. And when the Russians would say, "Come out, brother, surrender," the Ukrainians say, "Your Russians don't surrender," and they fight to the death. And that's the thing that surprised the Russians that I've spoken to the most, is that these Ukrainians are just willing to fight to the death. They're tenacious bastards who don't give up. And, it's impressed the Russians, but it's also created a killer mentality in the Russians now. There's oftentimes no mercy shown whatsoever. And a Ukrainian position, sometimes when it's defended to that end and the Ukrainians come out, again, I don't like to rely on movies, but I think if you remember in Saving Private Ryan, after the assault on the beach where the American troops were getting butchered and they finally broke through and got to the trenches and there's heavy fighting, and these they weren't Germans. I think they were from Ukrainians or Russians came out and they tried to surrender, and the guys just gunned them down because by that point in time they hate them because you caused so much trouble for them. And then the other thing is, if you're a mercenary now, I think the Russians have an order, especially in Kursk, don't take mercenaries prisoner. And then also the other thing is, if you're a drone operator, you're not going to have a good time if you surrender to the Russians nowadays. I'm not saying this is justifiable. Of course, it's a violation of the law of war. I'm just saying the war is hell and war is very violent right now. And it's a very tough situation for the Ukrainians.
Which is interesting, Scott, that you say this, because in the same article, they speak to a Ukrainian intelligence officer who believes that Russia has about 1 to 2 years left to fight as they are, and that nothing that they are doing will change the outcome on the battlefield, meaning that there will be no big gains at any point in the near future. Also putting in a little jab that Russians do not reward smart people, and cited an instance on the battlefield where apparently Russian forces broke the front line and had no idea that they did and retreated for no reason at all. Scott, this is the kind of narrative that keeps on getting pushed out, this, even as they admit that this very important town was just taken and that Pokrovsk is next. So where's the disconnect here?
The disconnect is in reality. We're gonna be in for an interesting ride right now in the next days and weeks to come, because the Ukrainian propaganda mill that feeds Western narratives, such as the one that you're quoting from, they've been defunded. So they receive all their money from USAID, from the United States government, and all that money has been frozen now because of Trump's orders. And so the propaganda machine is going to start to break down. And this carefully manufactured narrative, which is not based in reality. Look, war is, I mean, it's very complicated. And again, the only reason why I keep bringing up, TV shows and movies is that most people in your audience, I believe, have never been to war and haven't experienced it. But, look at Band of Brothers. And when they talk about the Battle of the Bulge, there were episodes where they talked about incompetent leadership on the part of the Americans, and the mistakes that were made and how Americans died because of that. But we won that battle and we won the war. Now, if you had a Ukrainian propagandist running around, he'd just cherry pick all the mistakes, the bad leadership here, the failure to perform here, the cowardism here, and he'd say, "See, that's the Russian army." Because, my God, the Russians had a failed leader. They had people who didn't perform right, and they had some cowards over there. But that's not the Russian army. That's just aspects of a very large machine. The machine itself is functioning very well, and there's far more competent leaders, far more heroic soldiers, far more soldiers that can do their job professionally than there are those that can't. This intelligence officer, I don't know if he made this stuff up. They're guilty of that too. But let's say he didn't. Let's say he just went through his files and said, here's this report, here's that report, here's that report. See, the Russians aren't as good as we think you are. That's just cherry picking bad news. When that's like me going out into a farmer's field of corn and walking around and finally finding one, go, grubs, your crop sucks, you got grubs. But that's it. There's no grubs on anything else. And when he harvests it, it's going to be a great harvest. But I'm focused on the one or two, corn cobs that got grubs in them. And I say the whole car. Look, the proof is in the pudding. Okay, if this Ukrainian officer is right, then the Russians will lose this war and we won't have anything to worry about. But why is it that every time I look at the battlefield, every week the Russians have advanced and advanced and advanced and advanced? Why is it everybody's starting to come out and say it's over? The Ukrainians have no. Why is Budanov, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, saying it's over, it's finished, we're done? So I just, you have to be careful. These intelligence officers that get quoted by Western media, that's their job. Their job is to support a propaganda narrative that's being pushed out in the West to shape the mindset of the American people so that we still have the confidence in continuing to pour billions of dollars into Ukraine when when it's competing with the legitimate needs of the American people here at home. That's what's going on here. It's not a real intelligence officer, giving a solid analysis of the situation. He's part of the larger propaganda game being played here. And those people who don't want to believe me, I don't care. All I know is that this time next month, the map will be different than it is today. And all of the changes will be to Russia's advantage. And maybe that intelligence officer, if he sticks around the front lines long enough, won't be issuing propaganda because he'll either be dead or captured.
Scott, given this reality on the ground, time seems to be of the essence here. And as we've spoken about, Donald Trump really isn't rushing, it seems like, to get into motion all of these plans that have been apparently leaked out and even stated by Trump and his team at points. Yet at the same time, my question to you is, uh, do you believe that, given that this is the reality on the ground, we know that Russia has been very clear that it is not going to concede when it is in a position of strength? Do you see Donald Trump being able to change the posture that he's already laid out? Is this part of what we saw during the talks regarding Korea and the DPRK and South Korea and those talks? I've heard you say that those talks, though, however, were dictated a lot by the Koreans, by South Korea and the DPRK, and Trump took advantage. Trump doesn't seem like the United States and Donald Trump don't seem like they're in a position to take advantage of this situation. What do you think about this in terms of Trump's ability to shift from where he's already walking, which seems to be a very dangerous trajectory with regard to this conflict?
Well, Trump does have to be careful not being seen as being too conciliatory to the Russians, or else he'll be accused of, the same thing he was accused of in the past, caving into Putin, being Putin's puppet, things of that nature. So I think one of the reasons why he's taking such a strong stance is to say that, I'm in charge, not Putin, and, we're not doing Putin's bidding. But he has also come out and made several strong statements about, Zelensky and, the fact that things aren't going well for Ukraine and Zelensky. And I this is all speculation because we just don't know what's going on inside Team Trump. But what I can say is that every week that goes by, Kellogg's plan becomes more and more farcical, and therefore, not viable to be presented. And the Ukrainian position becomes far more untenable and more likely of collapse. And I think, this 85-day window that Marco Rubio is putting on this U.S. aid to Ukraine is going to bankrupt it. You saw the Ukrainians they're in a panic right now. They've turned to Europe and said, we didn't think this was going to happen. We're not in a position. We don't have any money. We're out of money. The Clausewitz haters out there are going to hate me once again, but war is an extension of politics by other means, meaning that if you're focused solely on what's happening on the battlefield, the maneuvering on the maps, etc., you're focused on the wrong things. The politics of Ukraine. We've poured a significant amount of money into propping up the Ukrainian government in terms of payroll, in terms of paying off pensions and just funding society, to include funding the media, the Ukrainian propaganda machine. That's all done. That spigot's off. They're out of money. And if Europe doesn't pony up tens of billions of dollars immediately, it's going to collapse. And that's another way to bring Ukraine down, is to see the collapse of civil society. What happens when pensions aren't paid, when salaries aren't paid, when the whole country just runs out of money. The military may be out there; they might be getting more Patriot missiles, but salaries aren't being met. And this has a morale effect that can lead to the collapse of Ukraine from within, not just on the battlefield, from within. And I think if one of Trump's strategies is, rather than trying to force a round peg into a square hole, which is, what getting Zelensky to agree to the Russian terms, it's impossible. Just let the round peg die. And that seems to be the direction that we're headed right now, is to let Ukraine die from neglect, holding out that we're going to punish the Russians and we're going to do this, that, and the other thing to the Russians. But the fact is, if all we do is talk about this and continue to fail to fund Ukraine's political and social programs, Ukraine collapses from within very soon, very soon. And that may be the strategy, is to get the Ukrainians. I mean, imagine how more simple this problem will be if you wake up one morning, you're Donald Trump and Zelensky is gone. He's either been killed, kicked out, whatever. He's no longer there. And there's a new leader, probably the head of the Rada, who's going to be calling for new elections. And suddenly there goes one of those contentious negotiating points. Who's going to be at the table? And now, now Trump can be smart and turn to the Ukrainians and say, look, we got to bring this thing to an end. These are the terms. You got to accept the Russian terms. That's it. Because the only option, we can't save you anymore. If we try to hold off and try to sanction, those sanctions won't kick in. It'll take months, years. You're gone in a week. So maybe you need to surrender right now, and we'll try and take care of you on the back end. That could be the strategy that Trump's taking, because I think even Donald Trump is starting to recognize that the Kellogg plan is nonsensical and a non-starter.